All the videos online on this topic right now paint a really vague picture of how anime is made, or a really bleak picture. So it leaves those of us who actually care to learn about how anime is made without much direction on how to move forward. The most common path right now for learning how anime is made for non-Japanese people is to spend loads of money getting a bachelor's degree in the Japanese language, moving to Japan on a work visa, and spending months applying for animation studios in Japan while surviving on ramen and getting money from working fast food, teaching English, or selling art commissions. Then, after actually landing a job at an animation studio, figuring out how to keep your visa while earning less than a minimum wage, and grinding your way up the ranks from an in-betweener to an animation director. Not everybody wants to do this, and it leaves very little options for people who don't have the resources to move to Japan, who still want to learn the Japanese animation method. There's a reason anime looks the way it does, and a lot of it has to do with their production methods. And if you don't speak Japanese, it's really hard to get a clear picture of how they actually create this stuff. I once talked to the director of Sword Art Online at an anime convention, Tomohiko Ito, and I asked him what his advice was for being successful in the animation industry, and his advice was kind of short and simple. He pretty much just said, stop talking about making anime and just do it. Sounds kind of overly simple, but I mean, maybe he's right. But it's really hard to just do it when you don't really know how to do it. In this video, we're going to be talking about how anime is made, the process of taking it from conception to creation. We won't really be talking about pre-production, project funding, or pitching your animation. I think if people know how to make animation, they can just make it, like Tomohiko-san was suggesting. I'm kind of inspired by how Makoto Shinkai broke into the anime industry. What he did is he actually just made a 5-minute short, animated it, directed it, and voiced it himself, and I think he had help with 3 other people. Instead of pitching it to anybody, he just made 5,000 CDs or DVDs of it, and then just went around selling them at anime conventions. And that's how he got into the animation industry, and then he eventually directed the #1 highest grossing anime film of all time. In this video, I'm going to be talking with my friend Will. He's a American-born artist and animator who moved to Japan to work on anime, and he's also the co-contributor to the Striving for Animation channel. We're going to be providing an overview of the Japanese animation process and give you the resources and tools you need to learn more about the process. I spent a really long time trying to figure out how all this stuff works, and there's really not a whole lot of video resources like this, so enjoy. Alright, so I'm here with my friend Will. He's living in Japan right now. Will, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Will. I work as an animator doing keyframing and animation direction in Japan. I moved here from the US about 9 years ago to get into the industry, and I've worked with a lot of companies. I started out at Actis, working as an in-betweener on shows like Girls and Panzer.
You did freelance for quite a while, right?
Yeah, after about 3 years as an in-betweener, I did some freelance for about another 2 years. And then I worked on all kinds of late-night anime during that time. After that, I've been working full-time at OLM, working on shows like Beyblade.
We're going to go over basically how anime is made in Japan right now. We're going to go into depth a lot further than pretty much any video on YouTube in terms of vocabulary and steps.
Hopefully we can get some of the common misconceptions about the animation process explained so that people understand a little bit more, so that those that want to actually get into animation know what to do and how to do it. Okay, so here we have a flowchart of the overall creation process. It starts out with, of course, pre-production and script, but we're going to focus more on the actual animation process in this video. At the top here, we have storyboard, ekonte in Japanese. Konte comes from the term continuity. It exists as a plan for shot continuity, layout, and composition of all the shots, and to time out everything in a very general sense for a 23-minute episode of animation, or whatever the time form is for a particular production. Here's layout. Reiauto, daiichi genga in Japanese. Layout is the rough bare bones of the actual animation, including drawings of the roughs for the characters, effects, CG motion, camera work, and the background. After that, you have the first wave of checks, starting with episode director check. Reiauto enshitsu check in Japanese. The episode director check is done by directorial staff, and it's for fixing things like shot continuity, composition, character expressions to make sure that they fit with the voices and scenes, as well as the timing. The check exists predominantly to make sure that the intentions of the storyboard are reflected in the actual layout, or brush up where the storyboards were found to be lacking. Then after that, we have the animation director check, Reioto Sakkan check in Japanese. Animation directors are in charge of the actual drawings and how on model they are, so it's the draftsmanship side of the corrections. Animation directors are also known to draw corrections for the backgrounds and timing as well. Then we have miscellaneous check here. That's for stuff like mechs or effects, where they have a specific animation director to fix just those parts specifically. These specialized animation directors may or may not exist, depending on the production. After that, the cuts go through general or chief animation director check, and then the layout is approved. Since the background fixes are done by this point, the background painting is started here on the right, and anything for 3D animation that had a hand-drawn guide is given to the 3D animators. Next is second key, Daini Genga in Japanese. This is where the original layout artist gets his layouts back and retraces the drawings and all of the animation director's checks to clean up the animation for in-betweening. If circumstances dictate that the original artist can't work on the second key, it's handed off to other staff. After second key is complete, it goes through the same checking process from the episode director and the animation director, and then the second key is approved.
And after that, you have in-betweens, or doga in Japanese, a lot of which is sort of outsourced, right?
Yeah, especially nowadays, increasingly. Originally, you were supposed to start as an in-betweener and do it for 3 or so years, but nowadays in Japan, new animators are starting on second key more often. After that, you have in-between checkers that check for mistakes or missing parts, doga kensa in Japanese. Then it's scanned into a computer and colored digitally, shiage, and then checked, seru kensa. After everything is done, it's given to composition staff for digital compositing, satsue in Japanese. This is typically done in After Effects.
The first step we're going to be talking about is ekonte, which is sort of like storyboarding, but slightly different. In the West, the way storyboarding is usually done is that it's done by animators. In Japan, there's essentially one director who does the entire ekonte. Basically, the entire purpose of it is to ensure that the entire animation has a consistent cinematic style.
I'd say good storyboards have meaning behind everything in them. There's a storyboard artist that I used to work with that said, everything is handmade, so everything has to be intentional for it to contribute to the storytelling. Things like camera placement can't just be arbitrary. Instead, having actual meaning behind every shot, why you're shooting from low, why you're using the telescopic lens, is one of the most important things to be thinking about when you're drawing a storyboard.
Something that's kind of a giveaway for ekonte from Japan is that the drawings are really simple. A lot of times the directors of anime aren't even good at drawing, which was kind of surprising to me. You can decide a lot about cinematography and the motion of the characters without even having to really draw detailed versions of them. I've seen some directors that border on almost drawing scribbles and stick figures. Then there's directors like Hayao Miyazaki who watercolor paint every single frame of the storyboard. When you see that level of detail, it's usually a sign that the director wants to have more control over the final aesthetic.
People like Satoshi Kon and Yasuomi Umetsu are also famous for their meticulous storyboards, and that's mostly because they don't like having to fix everything later on. If you have a solid storyboard like they do in the West, you spend less time redrawing layouts as an episode director in the checking process. The problem with everything being too tight, though, means that skilled animators have less room to breathe and be original with their animation. So that and alleviating time constraints are both big advantages to the looser Japanese storyboarding style.
After the ekonte phase, the project moves to the staff who make the layouts and rough key animation.
Layout is basically the raw bones for the entire shot, and essentially all of the necessary keyframes, camera work data, the necessary drawings for the background staff. There's also these things called books, which are basically background data except as transparencies. The name comes from them being sort of stuck between cells like bookmarks. If you have trees that are on top of a character on a different layer, the layout artist and then the background artist will have to draw those as well. Filling out the timesheets are also an important part of layout. So starting out on your average layout, you would go from thumbnails of the storyboard, from which the key animator will draw the backgrounds, the roughs for all of the keys in the cut, and then fill in the timesheet going by the timing that was provided in the storyboard.
So the rough animation happens the same time as the layouts?
Yeah, a lot of people think that the layout is just the background, Actually, it used to be like that, but nowadays the steps animators take have been split into first key and second key animation. Daiichi genga to daini genga. It's basically the invoice for everything that you'll actually need for a shot in first key, and then the cleanup of all that stuff in second.
Here's an example of a digital layout and rough key animation. What program do you think was used for the background here?
This was actually done in Blender, and I believe he used a VR rig to make the camera motion. The animator is Yusuke Kawakami, by the way. He has lots of really amazing work on his Twitter, so if anyone is interested, I recommend you check it out.
So he renders it and goes in with a VR headset and uses that to help with the cinematography.
Yeah, it looks like he simulated a camera with the VR headset, and then exported the video as an image sequence. On series like 2B Hero, they have certain settings that they use for VR with hand-drawn backgrounds to make camera work.
It's definitely not industry standard, definitely some experimental modern stuff. Super cool though.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of cool stuff you can do with computers, but much of it is just now catching on.
Do you think this animation here was hand-drawn or digitally drawn?
This is hand-drawn on a computer. There are people out there like Ko Yoshinari who like to do completed animation, including all the color digitally with fancy painted effects and stuff, but it's very much an outlier and it can lead to some scheduling problems depending on the production. This is a timesheet, or an X sheet as referred to in the West. It is essentially a vertical timeline on 24 frames per second, as per film. Each of these horizontal cells represent one frame, with the vertical columns being layers. Starting from the top, you have where you write the episode number, the title, scene, cut number, the time in seconds plus frames, the keyframer's name, the compositor's name, and in the top right, the page number. In the direction and memo section, you write specifics on camera work, effects, anything you need the composite staff to understand to apply post-processing or camera or layer motion.
Here you can see an example of how a rough animation lines with the timesheet. The timesheet looks really complicated, but it's actually really helpful for simplifying a lot of information to the next person who's going to be touching the cut. It's pretty rare for people to draw the layout and do the animation themselves all the way through in-betweening, so it's important for the timesheet to really decide the movements ahead of time. I notice a lot of this is blank. Is there many times where the entire sheet would be filled up?
Yeah, depending on the shot, timesheets have to be very specific. This is all blank because this is a static shot with no camera or cut-specific post-processing in the scene. Some people can go really overboard with the camera effects and have an entire sheet filled up with scribbles. It's really hard to understand sometimes.
Each column, A through F, each one represents a cell layer, right?
Yeah, a cell layer. The books that I mentioned earlier that are background data are written between the cell columns in order to sandwich them between cells. You can also apply slides and zooms to any layer independently to simulate three-dimensional camera movement. The left side here is for keyframers, and they leave the right side blank for in-betweeners. To the right of that, there's a place to write instructions for timing-sensitive camera work like camera shake, blur, or transitions like crossfades or fade-outs. Camera shake, for example, is often represented by a squiggly line that looks like a seismograph to represent how strong the camera shake is.
In the next phase, the layouts and rough animations are packed up in a folder and passed off to the episode director to start the checking phase. The episode director in anime would be very similar to a film director. Episode directors oversee music, voice acting, sound effects, and basically everything.
The two staff that have the biggest influence on the quality of production are probably the episode directors and the production manager. The episode director is in charge of directional oversight on the workflow for every step of the process, as well as being the most responsible for the actual direction and flow of an episode. Correction staff always use colored paper to tell it apart from the layout artist. The episode director often uses pink or blue. When doing corrections, episode directors will change the timing, staging, shot composition, and character expressions, and will draw corrections on top of the layouts if something feels inappropriate for a cut.
You don't have to be an animator to be an episode director, do you?
Nope, they aren't usually draftsmen by trade, so the corrections are more focusing on directorial instruction, like the way that they want to show the background, the type of lens, as well as technical things like how fast to slide a background on a follow shot. Whatever a live-action director might point out when leaning over a screen talking to a cinematographer or explaining what he wants from his actor's performance are the type of things the episode director fixes. The assistant director and series director are in the same position, but supervising the entire series. They don't always have time to look at every cut from every single episode, but they review the most important parts with oversight over the entire show.
So basically, the episode director is in tune with what the series director is wanting.
Yeah, they're basically like a middleman for the series director to help mitigate the massive amount of work that has to be done amongst the three of them. After director check is complete, the cut is moved on to the animation director, who generally focuses on just fixing the drawings and making sure everything is on model. The animation directors are in charge of drawing correct proportions, character balance, and the overall draftsmanship of every drawing within a cut.
Animation director is basically the highest you can get in animation staff, right?
There's general animation director and character designer on top of that as well.
What's the difference between an animation director and a general animation director?
Animation director is per episode, so they only work on a single episode at a time. A lot of times there are many animation directors that work on the same episode. This is a pretty recent development. Till about 15 years ago, 1 or 2 animation directors was the norm for a 30-minute episode. Nowadays there can be 10 or more depending on the production. In contrast, the general animation director sits on top of that in the same way that the series director sits on top of the episode director. Their job is to oversee the animation for the entire series. There are usually only 2 or 3 for an entire series, with one taking even number episodes and the other one taking the odd numbered ones.
While all this is going on, the backgrounds are getting painted, which would have gotten started after the layouts and layout corrections were approved. Background painters usually work exclusively as background painters. They will paint the backgrounds digitally or physically with tempera paints.
Yeah, I think it's called Posca color. I think that the thing that gives older animation its look is the type of paint it uses and the analog compositing techniques. Backgrounds are definitely not limited to one medium though. Watercolor can be used, for example, and recently Photoshop is the most popular software for background art.
While the background painters are working on painting, the animators get back their folder of all the things they've done wrong that they get to redo from the corrections staff.
When you're first starting out as a keyframe animator, this can be kind of depressing, in that you see how bad your original layout was, and also how much it's been corrected. Ultimately, it's better that you have actually been corrected thoroughly than to have something terrible on screen at the end. Often lack of time can prevent the corrections from getting done. So the more corrections there are, the more chance you have to learn something, even if sometimes you don't agree with all the corrections that are done. You can internalize those corrections best by thinking about why they were made, so you don't sort of end up drawing or animating in a vacuum. Listening to people's advice and then growing from that, and having that as a systematic part of the process, is one of the best parts of working as an animator in Japan.
I was reading that in the 70s, most people who worked in animation didn't want to be animators, they just wanted to be mangaka. Apparently animation was a good place to train for drawing.
It is true that a lot of people want to start as animators so they can get good at drawing. In Japan, the skill floor is pretty low right now because of animators being in low supply, so you can get in and get a good opportunity to do lots of drawings in a short amount of time. You also get to see a lot of corrections from a lot of insanely skilled people.
It's almost like you're mentored by them.
Yeah, initially it was set up to be mentoring as a process, but it's sort of deviated from that ideal with mass production. People meet a lot less in person nowadays. You still get the corrections though, so it's still a great learning opportunity.
So there you guys have it. The best way to learn how to draw anime is to go to Japan.
Oh, yeah, just forget about drawing from life and all that stupid stuff. No, I'm kidding, but this is a great opportunity to see drawings from extremely experienced staff.
After the animators go through the painstaking process of redoing their animation and learning from the animation directors, it goes to the workhorses of the animation industry, the in-betweeners. The in-betweeners are usually the staff that has to spend the most time with a single cut.
There's usually more in-betweeners than keyframers.
They outsource because it's cheaper, right?
Actually, they pay the same wages domestically as they do overseas. It's about 220 yen for one in-between. And if it takes you 40 minutes to draw a frame, which was about the average for me when I was an in-betweener, it's really not a lot of money. Wages have been stagnant for 20 or 30 years to the point that pay isn't really compatible with the cost of living in Japan. There's just not enough staff in-house or within the country to get the work done on time, so they end up outsourcing to foreign countries. I hear it can be a pretty decent paying job depending on where you live in China though, because the cost of living is lower. This leads to a self-perpetuating cycle of not having pay that attracts domestic staff and an increasing margin of outsourced work.
There are probably plenty of gaijin that would like to work on in-betweening, but they probably couldn't keep their visas up at those wages.
Generally, you have to be making at least minimum wage to get a work visa to Japan, so that's a very real barrier, yes. So the first most important thing in in-betweening is that you have to trace the keys to increase the fidelity compared to the keys while looking at the character design sheets.
So their lines are the actual lines you see on screen, which is kind of cool. Even though you're at the bottom of the barrel in the studio, your lines are the ones that actually appear on screen.
Yeah, I think it doesn't really get enough appreciation. I mean, you can draw as precise as humanly possible and do the most nuanced second key corrections in the world, but it means nothing if the in-betweener isn't given the time to properly trace in between those forms. Another thing is that in-betweeners used to have a relationship between in-between checkers and keyframers, similar to that between keyframers and checking staff. They could show their work to the keyframer of the actual cut they were working on to get advice on the motion. Also, they had to get a pass from the in-between checker in order to send out their work. Nowadays, in-between checkers are forced, due to time constraints, to do what is called a pre-outsourced check, makimaya check, where they fill in tough to in-between parts or places that are likely to melt and then send the work out to get the work back and then perform as many fixes as they can on the final results. But there isn't the learning experience you get from that back and forth between the actual in-betweeners and the in-between checker. Although this is something that can't really be helped due to time constraints, the adoption of these practices hurts a lot of new in-betweeners by not giving them those learning chances. I think the most important and interesting thing about in-betweening is that you get to see every single thing in the cut folder, from the layout, all of the corrections, the second key, and the timesheet. You're supposed to look at all these things and study them to figure out how and why everything is drawn or written the way it is. So it's as much of a training period and an opportunity to see the animation of skilled people in the industry as it is a job in itself. For in-betweening, one of my teachers taught me that the easiest way to have fun with in-betweening is to figure out what's interesting within the limited confines of tracing and in-betweening lines and pursuing that.
If you have the right attitude, it's like, wow, this is amazing.
Yeah, there's a lot to enjoy there. Sometimes we would get a cut from a famous animator and everyone would crowd around and see the hot, fresh keys.
Something that's indicative of Doga is that the lines are very decided on. There's no sketchiness. Highlights and shadows are denoted with blue and red lines, red being the highlights and blue being the shadows, but this can sometimes differ from studio to studio. After in-betweens are done, they are scanned and sent back. For the longest time, I thought that they were actually traced again digitally by hand, which is wrong. We got a link for a really cool program in the description. It was made by Studio Ghibli called OpenTunes. It's a free program that just does the tracing for you. The industry standard program that they use in Japan is called Traceman. And what's crazy, it just turns your pencil into pixel and gets it ready for coloring.
It's basically a filter, yeah.
Yeah, after running it through the program, staff will use the paint bucket tool and fill in the color according to predetermined palettes, which are usually on the character design sheets. Coloring requires no particular drawing skills, you just have to have color vision. So if you can't draw and you want to do anime, get into coloring.
It does help to have drawing skills, though, to help you figure out what line goes to what. I've seen my fair share of nightmare line work that you can't tell what parts are supposed to be what color, so that's one tough part about the job that can be alleviated by having some drawing knowledge, though it's definitely not a prerequisite.
This is a visualization of what the coloring looks like. The second column is a scan of the pencil drawing, and to the left of it you can see what it looks like after running through Traceman or OpenTunes. And the third column you can see what it looks like after being filled with a paint bucket tool. Sometimes the lines aren't attached completely, which is usually a mistake from the Doga or from the filter.
On the hair here, too, where you can see that they've changed the lines from black to gray, it's actually a hand-applied filter.
Oh, so they have to trace every single frame.
Not trace, but they are using basically a selection tool to isolate and change the colors for just the hairlines. When digital coloring was in its earlier stages, shows like Macross used to draw all the lines for the hair in red colored pencil so that the paint staff didn't have to do the separation work manually. Red colored pencil is held to erase though, so nowadays it's more often left to the coloring staff, along with other increasingly more subtle correction work like connecting lines. When working with scanned pencil drawings, no matter how thoroughly you tried to connect all of the lines analog, once you apply the filter, spots with lighter line color can create gaps in the final line work. If you try to get everything perfect on analog paper and just scan it in and apply the filter, there's a point where you get diminishing returns, and sometimes it's better to just let the coloring staff fix that.
You can see in this cut everything has been brought together, the finalized in-betweens, the coloring, the backgrounds, the post-processing effects. There's a separate staff that will do compositing, and sometimes the directors will get involved, like Makoto Shinkai, who does the lighting for every single cut.
Yeah, that's where he likes to leave a lot of his touch.
Yeah, you can usually tell it's a Makoto Shinkai film by its lighting. Something a lot of people wonder is what programs are being used to compile the animation. They use After Effects, usually to finalize the cuts, and Adobe Premiere to string all the cuts together.
Each cut gets exported after the composition is completed in After Effects. It then gets dropped into an Adobe Premiere file and synced up with the audio from the animatic. Any final frame editing happens in Premiere as well.
And that concludes our first video. We hope that you learned something. If you did, if anything surprised you, go ahead and put it in the comments. If you would like to see us make more content like this, please subscribe. Thanks.